Mark Ruffalo was standing in the first-class line. His simple, comfortable clothes stood out from the elegance around him, creating a contrasting yet sincere image. Among the dismissive glances, one stood out in particular, a man full of arrogance. But Mark's demeanor remained unaffected by these glances. What was about to happen would not only change a flight, but also a man's entire perspective. Before diving into the story, if you enjoy such heartfelt moments, don't forget to mention which platform you watched it on in the comments. Also, subscribe, because another special story awaits you tomorrow. Los Angeles International Airport was bustling and chaotic. Passengers were rushing around, voices were mingling, and luggage was being tossed in all directions. In the middle of the crowd, a calm and thoughtful man was waiting in the first-class line. Mark Ruffalo. He was wearing a worn pair of jeans, old but well-maintained boots, and a backpack that seemed to carry the weight of years of travel. He wasn't flashy, but there was a sense of weight to his presence. This simplicity didn't come from his clothes, but from an inner peace. The hustle and bustle of the airport didn't seem to disturb his calm. While everyone else was rushing around, Mark waited patiently, looking around as if he wanted to see the details of life. Behind him, a man waiting in line was his complete opposite. Victor Harding. He was wearing an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a heavy perfume that could be smelled from a distance. His posture seemed to scream, "I belong here." Every move he made seemed calculated to attract attention. Victor's eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Mark Ruffalo, he couldn't hide his condescending smile. "First class, huh?" he said mockingly. "It's getting harder to tell who's coming here these days." Mark turned his head and looked at him. There was a subtle expression on his face. "Yes, life sometimes brings unexpected faces our way." Victor frowned briefly. He had expected a more defensive response, but Mark's answer surprised him. There was a confidence beneath the silence. Victor pushed the boundaries a little further this time. "Excuse me, but we don't see you around here much," he said with a slight smile. "You seem quite comfortable." The announcement for boarding was made. The first-class line began to move forward. Mark and Victor stood side by side, tickets in hand, and joined the line. Victor walked with his usual confidence, as if he were taking the stage. Mark, on the other hand, was unaffected by the chaos around him and walked with peaceful steps. When they entered the cabin, a small coincidence occurred. Victor looked at his ticket again, and when he looked up, saw that Mark was sitting next to him. "Are you serious?" he muttered. He shook his head in disbelief. He looked at Mark and let out a short laugh. "With all this space, right here?" Mark smiled at him, not a trace of discomfort on his face. "Looks like we'll be spending a few hours together," he said. His voice was soft, but his message was clear. Victor crossed his arms over his chest to hide his discomfort. His real discomfort stemmed from sharing this private space with the man he had looked down on just a few minutes ago. Mark's presence made him uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. When the economy class passengers had finished boarding, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, trying to appear friendly. "What do you do?" he asked as if he already knew the answer. Mark adjusted his backpack under the seat in front of him and looked up, smiling. "I'm in the film industry," he said simply. Victor raised his eyebrows slightly. I see. Advertising?" Mark nodded politely. "Partly." Victor chuckled briefly. "People always try to find a place that suits them, but some places aren't for everyone, like first class, for example." Mark turned to him with a brief pause. There was no judgment in his eyes, only thought. "Maybe everyone has a place," he said softly, "and sometimes the place we are in is already there." Victor smiled slightly. A philosophical approach. Nice, but real life isn't that simple. Mark didn't respond. He turned his gaze to the window. He preferred the silence. But Victor continued, as if in a battle for superiority. He leaned toward him. "You may be sitting here, but there are some things you can't buy. Not everyone belongs in these chairs." This time Mark didn't speak. He simply looked at Victor with a gaze that carried patience and a gentle resolve. He gave a wordless answer, but perhaps that was the strongest answer of all. There was something in Mark's gaze that words couldn't describe. It was as if he were saying, "Sometimes silence is more powerful." When Victor realized that his provocation had not had the desired effect, he leaned back with a confident smile. He thought he was in control, but in fact, this was only the beginning. Mark's silence was a harbinger of a deep awareness that was about to dawn. By the time cabin service began, the plane was already in the air. The flight attendant moved on to serving drinks to first-class passengers. Victor, who had made a habit of drawing attention to himself, raised his glass. "A champagne, please," he said with his characteristic smile. "This seat deserves it." The flight attendant smiled and nodded. When it was Mark's turn, his tone was quite calm. "Could I have a bottle of water, please?" Victor immediately seized the opportunity. He let out a mocking laugh. "Water? Seriously? Are you going to spend your first-class luxury on water?" Mark took the bottle from the flight attendant with a soft look in his eyes. "Sometimes simple is enough," he said. Victor narrowed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to understand the answer, but then returned to his mocking tone. "Maybe. I mean, some people don't deserve the best. Not everyone can carry the luxury that life offers." Mark said nothing. He simply raised the water bottle and took a quiet sip. The other passengers had begun to notice Victor's harsh tone, but Mark's calm demeanor kept the atmosphere peaceful. "The best isn't the same for everyone," Mark said in a sincere voice. Victor didn't like that answer. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the conversation. Or maybe those who talk like that are the ones who've never achieved anything of real value. The flight attendant glanced at them briefly while serving a passenger further down the aisle, but seeing that Mark was handling the situation skillfully, he did not intervene. Mark smiled slightly and turned his head back to the window. Victor, however, was uncomfortable. He wanted to talk more, or rather continue to provoke. But Mark's lack of response was a type of resistance Victor wasn't used to. He was beginning to realize the difficulty of this silent opponent. He thought he was superior, but the other passengers were starting to notice his arrogant attitude. Mark, however, had not lost his initial calmness. He was speaking from a place much deeper than people's judgments. The flight attendant returned and continued serving drinks. Victor picked up his champagne glass and began to speak, shaking it as if his ego were bubbling inside. "Life is like flying first class. You work hard, earn your place, then enjoy it. But some people, they're just here by luck." Mark slowly placed his water bottle back on the tray. When he turned to Victor, his gaze was still calm, but there was now a clarity to it. "Luck or effort, whatever it is, when the plane lands, we all end up in the same place, don't we?" he said in a soft but determined tone. The cabin fell silent. The nearby passengers listened intently. Some looked at each other, realizing that this was no ordinary conversation. Victor was impressed but tried to hide it. He smiled, but it wasn't genuine. "I didn't say that. Some people really belong at a higher level. Not everyone can understand the value of this place." Mark leaned forward slightly, folding his hands in his lap. He turned to Victor with a calm but direct gaze. "I think the value of being here," he said, gesturing around the cabin, "has nothing to do with what you have, but with how you treat others." His words hung in the cabin air like a revelation. No one objected at that moment, because everyone could feel that it was true. Some passengers nodded slightly while others exchanged approving glances. Victor, however, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He tried to smile, but the tension at the corners of his mouth gave him away. "That was a good line," he said sarcastically. "Quite impressive. The new philosophy of first class. Self-help. Maybe you should consider giving motivational speeches." Mark didn't turn to him. He just left a faint smile on his face and turned toward the window. He didn't respond, but his silence spoke louder than words. The passengers in the cabin sensed the tone of the silence. Whispering began in the back rows. Some shot Victor disapproving glances. A few passengers even seemed to recognize Mark, but out of respect for his privacy, they didn't break the silence. Victor, however, began to realize that he was being watched, and that he was now the one being watched. His once confident posture seemed a little slumped, but he wasn't ready to admit that he had lost control. He considered himself the master of the debate, but people's reactions told a very different story. He didn't know yet that what was about to happen would shake his understanding of status, superiority, and true respect. When the flight attendant passed by to collect empty cups, Victor wanted to speak again, this time in an even more condescending tone. You know, this is actually quite funny. Then he narrowed his eyes and asked, have you ever noticed? People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about simplicity and humility. Mark leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with Victor. And I've noticed, he said slowly but clearly, that most of the time, it's the people who show off the most who are trying to hide what they lack inside. His words hung in the air for a few seconds. Victor froze for a moment, opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. The silence that surrounded them showed that Mark's words had already hit home. The other passengers exchanged brief glances. Mark's calm but meaningful answers had caught the attention of many. Some nodded in agreement. Mark's patience and composure in the face of provocation had not gone unnoticed. Victor finally gathered himself and spoke. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but the world is a competitive place. If you don't show what you've got, people will ignore you. That's how it works. Mark leaned back slowly in his seat. His eyes were still on Victor. Maybe, he said in a soft tone, but I believe that true success isn't something you shout about. It shows itself on its own. His words echoed through the cabin. A few passengers bowed their heads slightly. An elderly man sitting nearby turned his head toward Victor and made no attempt to hide his displeasure. Victor began to notice how people were looking at him, but he didn't back down. This time he spoke in a harsher tone. Those are nice words, but the real world doesn't work that way. It's a philosophy that sounds good, but it seems a little cheap. Mark turned to him, his expression still soft but clear. The real world is shaped by people, Victor. And in the end, who we are is understood by how we treat others. Victor's discomfort was evident on his face. He glanced around. The attention was no longer on him, but on Mark. Passengers were whispering, some looking directly at him. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Victor realized that his game plan wasn't working. He was beginning to feel that the moments when he thought he looked strong were actually making him look weaker. The atmosphere in the cabin was filled with palpable tension. Victor crossed his arms over his chest as if to hide the effect Mark's words had had on him, but the lines of tension on his face were becoming more pronounced. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be in another universe amid all this tension, calm and patient. Finally, he broke the silence. His tone was still calm but more sincere. Victor, he said, I understand what you mean. The world can be competitive, Mark said slowly. But over time, I've come to realize that the need to prove something to others is sometimes not just an outward battle, but an unresolved struggle within. Insecurity, resentment, maybe even a feeling of not being seen. Victor furrowed his brow. He couldn't quite decipher the underlying meaning of those words. Was this a provocation or an honest conversation? He asked skeptically, internal struggle? What is that supposed to mean? I don't know where you're coming from, but you're completely wrong. Mark smiled. He didn't take offense. Maybe, he said, but I've known many people who measure success by things that others can see, and most of them were trying to cover up something missing inside. This sentence struck an unexpected chord with Victor. He paused for a moment, lost in thought. He began to turn the ring on his finger between his fingers, unaware of it, but he quickly regained his composure and returned to his defensive stance. I'm not like that, he said harshly. Whatever I've achieved, I've worked hard for it. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. Mark listened patiently. He paused for a few seconds before responding. I'm not saying you haven't worked hard, he said softly, but sometimes we get so focused on what we've achieved that we forget to look inside ourselves. If all of this, the fame, the success, the status, weren't here, who would we be? Victor clenched his jaw. The question unsettled him, but he tried not to show it. Still, the words seemed to spin around in his head. He let out a mocking laugh. Us? We are what we build. If we didn't achieve anything, what would be left? Mark's expression didn't change, but his tone was even more determined. I disagree. What defines us isn't what we accumulate. It's what we do for others. Not how much we earned, but what we contributed to others. Not what we showed, but what we carried. He pointed to his heart. The silence in the cabin bore witness to his words. Some of the passengers nodded. A few looked meaningfully at Mark. Victor was still trying to control his anger. He rose slightly from his seat. "It's easy for you to talk," he said almost angrily. "You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've been through, what I've given up." Mark replied in a firm but direct tone. "Yes, you're right, Victor. I don't know your story. But sometimes the need to talk so loudly about one's achievements can be a sign that there is something one is trying to hide. Fear, insecurity, loneliness." These words hit Victor like a slap in the face. His face flushed with anger and shame. He clenched his fists, breathing as if trying to swallow the words. But he couldn't hold back any longer. He suddenly stood up and slammed the empty champagne glass he was holding onto the ground. "Do you think you're better than me?" he shouted, shattering the cabin's silence in an instant. "Sitting there like you figured out life? Lecturing me with your smart words? You don't even know what it means to live in the real world." The passengers turned their heads in shock. The flight attendant hurried over, but hesitated for a moment before intervening. Because Mark was still standing there. He hadn't lost his composure. His eyes were fixed on Victor. He waited for him to finish. Then he spoke in a deep but soft tone. "No, Victor, I don't think I'm better than you. I just want to say, sometimes we need to stop and think about what's really important. And believe me, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." Mark's voice hadn't risen, but his words cut like a knife. Victor took a deep breath. The anger on his face began to fade. He didn't just look angry. He looked tired. Not defeated, but like he was starting to break down. He sat down silently. Mark's words were still echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt completely exposed. He had never felt so vulnerable. But deep down, he sensed that this wasn't the end. It could be the beginning. The air in the plane had changed. The silence that followed the confrontation was heavy and meaningful. Victor couldn't bring himself to look at Mark again. He averted his gaze and remained deep in thought in his seat. Mark, on the other hand, continued to look out the window as if nothing had happened a moment ago. He was still calm, still in the same place. A short time later, the flight attendant approached Mark Ruffalo. He had a sincere smile on his face, and his voice echoed throughout the cabin. "Mr. Ruffalo, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection to Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his warmest regards." The name Ruffalo echoed through first class. A few passengers who had been watching up until that moment opened their eyes in surprise. A murmur spread through the cabin. Victor froze in his seat. The words almost slipped out involuntarily. "Mark Ruffalo." Mark nodded politely and thanked him. He turned to Victor, who was still watching him. Still calm, but now in a more explanatory tone, he asked, "Is there a problem, Victor?" He asked the question with a slight smile, but there was a clear message behind it. Victor opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. He looked around and noticed that the other passengers were now looking at him with curiosity and even a hint of judgment. He slumped into his seat. His discomfort was evident. He tried to gather his words to defend himself. I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say who you were." He finally managed to speak. "I didn't know it was you." Mark's voice was still calm, but the determination in his tone was clearer. "I didn't need to tell you, Victor. I don't carry my name around like a business card. And frankly, it doesn't matter who I am." Victor was silent for a moment. He swallowed hard, then tried to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt you. It's just, if I had known who I was talking to, maybe—" Mark sighed softly and leaned forward. His eyes were fixed on Victor's. "But that's not the point, is it?" he said in a soft but strong voice. "How you treat people shouldn't change based on who they are. True value isn't about who you're talking to. It's about how you talk to them." These words completely silenced Victor. There was obvious embarrassment on his face. He looked at Mark. Then his eyes drifted to the other passengers. He was now aware of those watching him. There was a message in all their eyes, not just for him, but for all of us. Mark broke the silence in the cabin once more. This time, it wasn't a lesson, but a reminder. "Victor, life is already hard for all of us. And the last thing we need in this world is people who belittle others to make themselves look better." With those words, Victor bowed his head. This time, he didn't argue. He just stayed silent. And for the first time, it seemed like he was thinking about what he had said. Mark leaned back in his seat. his gaze still calm but effective. He had said his piece. At that moment, he chose to think rather than speak. Victor stared silently at his hands. Like words slipping through his fingers, he relived every sentence that had just been spoken in his mind. This was no longer an argument, it was a confrontation. And not just with Mark, with himself. All his pride, his attempts to assert his superiority, were being stripped away. Victor's expression had changed. The man who had once seemed to rule the cabin now sat shy and embarrassed. Throughout the journey, it was not Keanu but Mark who had spoken much more deeply in the silence and simplicity. And perhaps it was that simplicity that had stripped Victor of all his masks, one by one. As time passed, Mark's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the thing we seek most is the thing we find least in ourselves. The words were simple, but they carried a world within them. As the plane began its descent, Victor took a deep breath. He had made his decision. His eyes still fixed on the ground, he spoke in a quiet voice. I need to apologize. Not just for what I said, not just because of who you are. I was arrogant. I acted foolishly. Mark turned his head. His gaze was the same as always. Calm, warm, non-judgmental. I accept your apology, Victor. But more importantly, I hope you've really learned something from this. Victor nodded slowly. It was not just an apology, but a sincere intention to change. Mark continued. Sometimes the thing we seek most in the world is the thing we have least within ourselves. I hope that one day you will see what is truly important. When the plane doors opened, Victor was still sitting in his seat. Mark stood up and quietly gathered his things. As they made their way to the terminal, Victor watched him. When fans approached him and politely asked for photos, Mark responded patiently, smiling at each one. He didn't rush. The kindness and simplicity came from within. It wasn't an act. Victor looked down at his hands. He sighed deeply. Mark's words still echoed in his mind. True value is not measured by status, but by how you treat others. As Mark disappeared into the crowd, Victor felt a glimmer of hope for real change for the first time. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe this trip was meant to be a new beginning for him. Because life is shaped by choices. Do we live to influence others? Or to become better people? Mark's parting words were clear to everyone. True success is not about what you have, but how you touch others. If this story touched you, share your thoughts with us in the comments. Write down the sentence that has changed you the most in life. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow another story that will touch your heart is waiting for you. Click on the screen to discover other stories filled with hope, compassion, and inner transformation. Remember, the change you want to see in the world may begin with you.